Hey, it's Luke, and in this video, I want to talk to you about why using CTR as a metric for evaluating creative performance is a terrible idea, or at least futile, because CTR itself is not a good indicator of performance. And realistically, if you think about click-through rate as a soft metric, it does give us some indication of how engaging an ad might be, I guess in some sense, because you'd expect a higher click-through rate would tend to suggest the ad is more engaging, or it's encouraging people to click through more versus an ad that has a lower click-through rate, which I guess is effectively correct. So the reason we'd want a higher click-through rate is because obviously you want to get as many people to the website as possible. But we're normally operating in a performance environment, which means it's not just about the click, it's also about the cost of the click. So you could assume that a higher click-through rate would equal a lower cost per click and therefore give us better performance. But that's not the case because Meta operates in an optimized CPM environment, which means that different ads for different audiences are going to cost a different amount per 1,000 impressions. So we really need to factor in the cost of the click, because ultimately if we have a high CTR, but the cost is insanely high for the click, then we're not actually going to meet our targets in terms of performance. So I want to give you an example here of what that kind of looks like in this ad account. So this is just one of our clients, and I just want to show you some examples here. So let's take these two ads here. These are both, good performing ads. They're performing above average, and they're both spending a reasonable amount of money. So fairly similar performance. This one's actually performing slightly better in terms of ROAS and CPA, but it's fairly similar. So, relatively similar in terms of performance. Now, if we were to judge these ads and say, okay, which is the better ad? We looked at the things that kind of matter in terms of performance, then we would say that these ads are kind of similar. But if we were then to look at CTR, we would see that this ad has a 2% CTR and this ad has a 1% CTR. And so if we were using CTR as some sort of metric to assess performance for this creative, we would say, well, this ad is way better than this ad because it has double the click-through rate. But the reality is the performance that they're producing, the one that has a 1% click-through rate actually has a better cost per acquisition and also has a higher return on ad spend. And by the way, we're looking at 7-day click return on ad spend here as well, not including any view through attribution. Now, one thing you'll notice is, okay, so how can this ad that has a high CTR or double the CTR than this ad have lower performance? And we can look at things like, obviously, conversion rate, after someone clicks on the ad, if they click through and they don't buy, it doesn't really matter. And other thing we can look at is the cost per outbound click. Now, you'll notice here that this ad only has 5 cents more cost per outbound click. So cost to click from the ad through your website is only 5 cents more, even though it's got half the click-through rate. So the actual cost per outbound click, or the cost to get someone to the website, is actually very similar for both these ads, just within a couple of percentage points. And so why would that be? Why is the cost per outbound click relatively the same, despite the fact that this one has such a better CTR? And the difference is the CPM. So this ad has a $27.28 CPM, which means that for every 1,000 impressions, it's costing us $27.28. And this ad here only has a $14.29 CPM, which means it's only costing us $14.29 per 1,000 impressions. So we can see that although, this ad has double the click-through rate, it also has nearly double the CPM. So this is why the cost per outbound click is relatively similar. So CTR does give us some information about how clickable the ad is, but if we look at performance, it doesn't really tell us anything about how good these ads are in terms of doing their job for us, which is to create conversions. So using CTR as some sort of metric for success for your creative is not a good option. So now let's look at the lowest performing ads in this set of data. We have an ad that is performing at 1.69 ROAS with an $86 CPA. So nearly double the CPA and a much lower return on ad spend than the 2.75 we were getting on that top performer. And our CTR is actually better, 1.14% compared to the 1% that we were getting on the other ad. So we can see here there's no real correlation between CTR and performance. This ad here has a higher CTR, but also a much higher CPA and a much lower ROAS. So no correlation between CTR. For that reason, there is, from my perspective, literally no point in using CTR as some sort of metric to analyze creative performance. It does not matter in the grand scheme of things. So while we're here, let's also look at the fluctuation in CPM between these 4 ads. So here we've got a 16, 29, 48, and $20 CPM. We have an ad here that has a 1.3% CTR, which was, a relatively average CTR, but the cost per outbound click is $3.69 because the CPM is $48. So it's costing us $3.69 to get someone to the site when these other ads have a lower CTR and are costing less. Again, to prove my point that CTR is a useless metric that you should not be looking at when you're doing creative analysis.